In this video, we'll show you how to get started with Photoshop. The most important part to remember when working with Photoshop and Lightroom is how the interface between the two works. These work really well together once you set up and obey a couple of basic rules. So the first thing we're going to cover is how to open a file from Lightroom and then how to save it from Photoshop and still be able to find it back in Lightroom. So firstly, let's go over to Lightroom and bring that over, and we will examine a couple of things on how to set Lightroom up to talk to Photoshop correctly. We have a file open in Lightroom, and that's the one we want to work with. So let's just have a look firstly at our preferences, and we will set this up so it will work correctly. So we go to Edit, Preferences, and in the tab that opens we want to look at External Editing, and here we will look at the options for telling it how to work with Photoshop 2020, as you'll see here. The first thing we have is the option of the file format we want to work with. If you click on the little drop down, you'll see that you've got a choice of either TIFF or PSD. Either one works equally well. Obviously a TIFF file can be read by other software, whereas a PSD or Photoshop file can only be read by Photoshop. Adobe recommends that you work with a TIFF. It's best preserving color details from Lightroom, or alternatively Photoshop. Either one will work fine, so make your own choice there. And then the next thing we need to look at is the color space we want our file rendered into when we export from Lightroom to Photoshop. And you've got a number of choices here. What we want to work with is ProPhoto RGB, because that best preserves the color information from our raw file. And when we're working with a raw file in ProPhoto RGB, we want to ensure that we're working in a 16-bit format, which gives us over 32 million levels of tone between black and white, whereas an 8-bit file only has a maximum of 255 levels of tone. So we want to best preserve our tonal and color information in the file as we open it. And the last section down the bottom here is the resolution of the file. If you're not going to be printing your file, this is not really important to you. It just determines the size of the file in Photoshop. If you're going to be printing on an Epson printer, you want to set this to 360 dpi, or if you're working with a Canon printer, you'll want to work with 300 dpi. You can of course resize the image within Photoshop when you're working towards printing, which we will cover in a later video. But for the time being, let's just leave that at 360 for an Epson printer. And then having said all that, we will click OK. We're not going to worry about the second external editor here, because this is the bit we're concerned about. The main editing program is Adobe Photoshop. Click OK. It returns us back to the Lightroom interface. And so now we've set up the preferences on how the file is going to work with Photoshop. The next thing we will do is open that file in Photoshop. So we can actually just simply right mouse click anywhere on the image and select Edit in Photoshop 2020, or alternatively you can go to the menu at the top of the Lightroom workspace, select Photo, Edit in Photoshop 2020. Either one does the same thing, and the file will be rendered into a pixel file and opened in Photoshop. And you can see now that we've moved over to Photoshop, our file is now open. Now we're going to cover the basic tools in Photoshop shortly, but let's assume that we've already done some editing on our file and now we want to save it and we want to be able to see it back in Lightroom. So what we will do here, we will see here that initially our file is showing here as an NEF or Nikon RAW file. We want to save that back with those preferences we set up initially. So we'll go to File on the top menu, Save As, and by default Photoshop will try and save it back in the original folder from where you opened it, and that's the best preference for keeping everything working consistently with Lightroom. So we would put it back in the same folder where the original raw file is contained, and in this case I'm going to give it a new file name. I'm going to call it Test, and I'm going to retain my original file name that came with the raw file, because I want to be able to remember which image I started working on when I made the Photoshop file. You see here that it's already been set up to save as a Photoshop file, and it's a ICC Pro Photo file with the color space. We'll click save, and that will now be saved back into Lightroom, or into the folder where you opened it from. And if we go back to Lightroom, we can see what happened. Here's back in Lightroom. We go back to our folder, and we will see now that here is our raw file, and sitting next to it is our Photoshop file. And if you have these options turned on in Lightroom to have the additional information displayed in your grid view, you will see that this one is called test, and it's a PSD file. If I double click that, you will see the same information down at this bottom toolbar. Now, one really important thing to remember is once you've saved a file as a Photoshop file and imported it back into Lightroom, you do not do any further editing on that Photoshop file in Lightroom. And there's a very good reason for this, and that is if we've made some changes, and let's say we've committed the terrible sin, we've gone back to our Photoshop file and we've made some adjustments, and then we want to go back into Photoshop and re-edit it, we're stuck with a problem. If I right mouse click and say edit in Photoshop, I now have some choices, and this is where people get into trouble. I've already created a Photoshop file. I've got three choices to open it. If I edit the original file, which is the default choice, any changes I made in Lightroom will not be visible, but I will still have all my layers and other information that I created in Photoshop available to me. Or I could edit a copy of the file, and the problem is there that any adjustments I made in Lightroom will not be visible, so I've wasted my time. Or the third option is I could edit a copy of that file with the Lightroom adjustments. The only problem is that all of your layers that were created in Photoshop will now have disappeared, and you will have back to a single layered image that you can't go back and edit in Photoshop and go back over the work you've already done. So obviously you don't want to do that. You don't want to do any further editing of a file once it's been rendered into a Photoshop file. So again, if we've created a file, saved it as Photoshop, and you want to re-edit that file, you will now go back into Lightroom. Do not make any changes here. Just simply open it again in Photoshop and make sure you choose edit the original, and you'll still have access to all your file information. Let's just get rid of Lightroom for the moment, and we're back in Photoshop. We have a Photoshop PSD file, 16-bit ProPhoto RGB. Now we can commence doing our editing. We'll now look at a couple of options to make sure that everything we do in Photoshop is compatible with Lightroom. So in Photoshop, we'll go to our top file menu, and we'll go to Edit, Preferences, and let's just open the General tab, and it will open a new series of options within Photoshop. The ones that we want to work with is File Handling, just to make sure that when we save a file from Photoshop that it is readable in Lightroom and other software. And the one that's critical for us here is to, under the File Compatibility, maximize PSD and PSB. PSB is for very large Photoshop files, and by default it will be set to ask, but what we want to do is we want to change it to always make the file compatible with other file software, so that we can read the files in Lightroom and there's no problems. So that's the most important thing. Click OK, and we're done. The other thing that we might want to do in here is set up some other preferences, and we'll just have a look at that quickly again. Edit, Preferences, General, and let's have a look at the interface, Workspace. There are a whole lot of options here. Tools. The one that I like to use is I like to be able to zoom with the scroll wheel. By default this is not turned on, but I like to have it on to make it easier to work and zoom in and out of my image. So let's click OK. With that option ticked, we can now get to having a look at the tools and the way the toolbars work with Photoshop. Now, when you first open Photoshop, annoyingly, the arrangement of all the panels within Photoshop is not optimized for photography. It comes up with a workspace that is a generalized one. So let's have a look firstly how to set that up properly. At the very top of your Photoshop workspace, you'll see a main series of menu items. What we want to do is come across to Window, come down to the second item called Workspace, and what will happen is when you've initially installed Photoshop, it will be set up under this Essentials layout, which is not what we want for photography. You'll see here that there are other workspaces designed for graphic designers and painters and so forth, and there's one called Photography. So we want to choose Photography, and that will set things up in the way that makes it more easily usable for us photographers. So having set that up, you should have something pretty close to what I've got on screen here. So let's just have a look around the various tools and how they all work. The main thing that we work with is this toolbar on the left hand side of the screen, and I'll just change my tool for the moment to a pointer so that we can have a look at things. And you'll see a series of tools down the left hand side. These are our essential tools for working within Photoshop. And if you use your mouse and hover over a particular tool, a little animated screen will pop out and tell you what that tool is used for. For instance, this is a rectangular marquee used for making selections, and we can scroll down and look at a number of different ones. Let's just have a look at a quick one here that we're going to use, and that's the brush tool. And this is not only for painting on the image, but it's really essential for working with masks and layers in Photoshop, which we're going to cover very shortly. So having selected a tool from our left-hand toolbar, there's a secondary toolbar that appears under that main heading toolbar of all the file types, and this is called a contextual menu. When you choose a different tool within Photoshop, the items in this toolbar will change to suit whatever tool it is you've chosen. For instance, if you choose the text tool, it will give you options for writing with text. If you use the magnifier, it will give you various other options and so forth. So main toolbar is here. We'll cover some of those tools a little bit later. And then as you select a different tool within that toolbar, the secondary toolbar up the top will give you further options to choose from. Now the next thing to look at is most important in Photoshop is we work with what's called non-destructive editing, and that means that we never change the original pixels that we've opened from our raw file. And you'll see here, if you find the layers palette within your workspace, it may not be readily visible in the same way, but if you will be able to find it. If you can't see the layers palette, come up to Window and make sure that down the items down here you've got a little tick next to the word layers, and that will make sure that layers are visible. So when you first open your image, what you will see is one layer, and it will be called background, which is the base layer that we work with, and to the right of that will be a padlock that indicates that we don't want to change anything on this original layer. So now we're going to have a look at how Photoshop applies adjustments to our images. If you've been working with Lightroom, this is going to be a little bit different, so let's dive in and see how it all works. Now Photoshop works with a concept called layers, and many people initially have difficulty understanding how this works. So let's just use a little bit of an example to try and explain how we work with layers. Now here's a representation of our image, and just like we used to do in the old days of film, we could put a filter over the lens on our camera to give a different effect. So it would be something like this. We could actually apply a colored filter to do a color correction or some other effect over our lens. Well, when we're working with layers in Photoshop, we're effectively doing a similar thing. We're leaving our base image alone, and we're putting a layer or a filter over the top that will affect how we see the image below. And in Photoshop, we can build this up by applying a series of layers that will do different things to our images, not just color correction, but things like lightening, darkening, and things that have a little bit more complicated effects. But the basic principle is the same. As we turn on each layer or build up each layer, the effect will appear on the photograph below. And the next thing that we want to discuss is how we create these and how these work in conjunction with Photoshop. So try and keep that idea in mind. Let's go back to our test image that we're going to work with, and we want to apply what's called an adjustment layer to adjust the tonality, color, or whatever else in our image. Now, in our layers panel, if we move right down to the bottom, you will see a series of small tools here. The one that looks like a half circle, half white, half black, will give us options for new adjustment layers, or alternatively, if you're set up with the Photoshop Workspace, you will have a tab called Adjustments, and we have little icons here for the different types of adjustments that we might make to our images. Now, we're unlikely to use all of these, but let's just have a look at one here. For example, a black and white adjustment layer. If you click on the icon to select that, it creates a new layer above your image that you will see now. It's called black and white. Has a label. We have a little symbol here that indicates that this is a black and white adjustment layer, and we have here in the properties panel a series of channels here that will allow us to adjust the tonality of the different colors. You'll see here, if I move the red slider, which affects the sunrise colors, you'll see the tonality change in the image. Now, we have a series of default settings of different color mixes. Let's just say we wanted to try an infrared type look. It gives a bit of a simulation of infrared, or typically something like a yellow filter used for landscapes. You get some basic mixes of all those different channels. A blue filter, pretty bland in this instance, not very nice. What about a nice high contrast red filter? Gives the image quite a lot of punch. So we've now got a black and white adjustment layer, and let's have a look at how these all work. We've now got a layer showing above our base image. To the left of it, we have a little eye symbol. If you click on that eye symbol, that will turn that layer off and on, so that you can see, here's my base image, color image below. I've now created a black and white adjustment layer that is now visible above my image. This tells me what sort of adjustment I'm making. And to the right of this, this is a very important part of the image editing process. This is what's called the layer mask. And this tells me that I'm going to apply this effect to the whole of the image. A white mask indicates that the effect is appearing over the whole image. And if I was to click on that mask, you'll see a little rectangle line around that, and we move up to our properties panel. We now have a different set of properties. I can now invert that mask, which will fill it with black, and black means that this effect is now transparent, so that if I have an adjustment layer and it is filled with black on the mask, the effect is totally invisible. If I invert that again, it is completely affecting the whole image. And one of the most basic things we can do with our image editing is to apply this adjustment selectively. Now, it's very unlikely that you'd do a black and white adjustment layer and apply it selectively to an image, but this is just for the purposes of illustration. So how do we change the effect of this mask other than just inverting it from black to white? Well, there's a simple way to do that. We can actually paint onto this mask using our brush tool, and that's why I showed you the brush tool initially. If we come over to our brush tool, click on that brush tool to select it, we can now paint onto that mask with either black or white. Obviously the mask is now full of white at the moment, so if I was to paint onto that with white, there'd be no effect. But if I painted black on parts of that mask, we will see the effect. So firstly, let's have a look at, we've selected our brush tool. Let's go up to this top menu bar here. You can see if I click on this drop down here, it gives me the choice of different types of brushes. We'd nearly always want to work with a very soft edge brush so that whatever we do on the image is not visible. But let's just, for the example, use a hard edge brush so that you can see the difference of the effect. And then up above this, I've got the size of the brush. I can increase or decrease that, and I can have a different hardness on the brush, which is a little bit like using a paintbrush. and then if let's just say we're happy with that, let's go up here and look at the opacity. I can paint with the brush 100% opaque or 1%. If I paint on with 1%, it's going to have very little effect. If I paint on with 100%, it's going to be completely rubbing out or painting over what's there. And we have things like flow, which generally we would keep to below 100, and that just allows us to control how the paint effectively is applied onto this mask. Now, to select whether we're painting onto with the mask with white or black, we need to come down to our toolbar on the left hand side, and you'll see two little squares here. These are what's called the foreground and background colors, and if for any reason on your toolbar these are not showing as black and white, just click onto the even smaller black and white symbol to reset those to black or white. And in this case we want to actually paint on with black onto our mask, so if I click this little double-ended arrow, it'll bring black into the foreground and put white behind. I click again, brings white to the foreground. We can also do this by hitting the X key on our keyboard. That will swap those colors over. So okay, let's just say we're going to paint onto our adjustment layer on the mask with black, and let's just draw a line. You'll see now that I've actually got a bit of color coming through because I've now painted onto the mask, and you'll see this little icon here is showing me a black stripe across here, and this corresponds to the part of the image where I've painted through the mask and revealing what's below. And you'll see here that because I've used a hard edge brush, the edge is very solid and it gives a very nasty transition. So let's go back and choose a different type of brush. Let's go back and choose our soft edge brush and see what happens when I paint with a soft edge brush. You'll see that as I build in that painting exercise, I get a very soft transition, and that's why we'd normally use a soft edge brush to paint in an adjustment. Now that's in principle how that works. I've painted onto my mask. Make sure that before you start painting you select the mask and not the adjustment. If I selected the adjustment, my brush tool will give me a little symbol with a line through it saying you're not allowed to do that. It won't work, it will not do anything. So we need to make sure we're on the mask and then we can paint in. Now the beauty of painting onto a mask on an adjustment layer is that we've got almost infinite control over how this works. If I've decided I've painted over too much with my black brush, I can just simply hit the X key to bring white back into the foreground, and now I can paint that effect back out. And you'll see now that I'm removing this transparent part of the adjustment, and I'm going back to my full black and white image overlay. Now I used the black and white adjustment as an example to show how the mask works. Let's turn that off and let's go back to what we would normally do, and let's say something like adjusting the tonality of the image. Now there are several tools within Photoshop for adjusting tonality. In fact, the first three adjustment layers all do things with tonality. We have one, the first one's called the brightness and contrast adjustment layer. The second one is called levels, and the third one is called curves. Now we always recommend you use curves for adjusting tonality because it's a more sophisticated way to adjust the tonality in an image. The levels and brightness contrast are just dumbed down versions of the curves tool. So let's create a new adjustment layer using curves. So I click on that to activate a new layer. You'll see I've now got a second layer above my original one, and again I have an eye symbol, I have a little icon indicating what sort of adjustment it is, and a mask. By default, whenever you create an adjustment layer, it will come with a mask. Now let's just say that we've gone back to our black and white adjustment layer, and I no longer want that, I want to get rid of it. I can just simply click on that, hold down my left mouse key, drag it down, and hover over the rubbish bin icon in the bottom menu bar, and it's gone. We've still got our base image, nothing has been changed on our base image, but we now have a different adjustment layer here. And looking at curves initially it can be a little bit daunting, but it's just really quite a simple graphical representation of how the tonal values are going to be changed in the image. On the bottom horizontal axis we have a tonal range from black to white, and it'll be indicating here input and output. This is the input side of the image and this is the output side, and as it stands at the moment we have a diagonal line going up to the right that indicates that let's say that our midtone here, our midtone on the input is now output as the midtone. Now if I just click on that midpoint and drag upwards, what's going to happen is that what is now middle tone on the base image is now going to be output at something above middle range of tone on the image, and you can see on the image to the left when I do that it's actually lightening the image. And the same thing goes if I go back to my center point and I drag downwards, it's going to darken the output side. So that's just a simple way of representing what's going to happen. But of course if I was to drag that up, you'll see that instead of being a straight line we now have a curve, and the curve indicates that as we start to lighten our tones from the darkest tones up to the mid-tone, this line is now a little bit steeper, and that indicates that it's going to be more high contrast in that area. And then as we pass the mid-tone, that slope of the tone flattens out, and it indicates that the lighter tones are going to be increased at a more slow rate and less contrast. So we can do some things like put additional points on this curve and drag them around, and we can get quite different effects happening. So it's a very sophisticated way to work, and we'll cover this a little bit more in another tutorial. So having applied an adjustment to this image, you'll see if I come down and turn the eye indicator on and off that I've really lightened the lower parts of the image. But I've also lightened the top parts of the image, which I really didn't want to do. I wanted to keep that nice color in the sky. I just wanted to lighten the foreground. So again, using our brush tool, a very simple way to apply this adjustment selectively is just go and pick up our brush tool again, and this time we want black to paint onto the white part of the mask. So I choose X on the keyboard, and I can make my brush a little bit bigger to apply a very large adjustment. And a quick way to do that is to use the square bracket keys on your keyboard, which appear just to the right of the letter P on the keyboard. The right hand square bracket key increases the size of the brush. The left hand square bracket reduces the size of the brush. Now in this case we want to apply a fairly subtle adjustment, so I'm now going to go up, and instead of having my brush set at 100%, I'm going to drop it back to something like 50%. If I click and drag on the word opacity, you'll see that the opacity changes, or I can just simply highlight the numbers in there and say 30%. So each time I paint on with this brush stroke, I apply a brush stroke, it's going to apply 30% of black. So let's just do that, and if we look down at our mask, you'll see now that rather than being black, I have a nice grey indicator here that now this adjustment is semi-transparent. So if I just simply click and paint over parts of the image where I don't want that adjustment to occur, you'll see now that we've lightened the foreground, and this lovely bit of sky in the background is now more or less unchanged. And we probably would want to take it out of the water as well. And again, by painting in with low opacity, we can build up the effectiveness of these adjustments. So now that we've got one tonal adjustment here, we've lightened the image, let's have a look at making an adjustment to the hue and saturation, or in particular the saturation. So let's go back up to our adjustments toolbar, and let's select the type of adjustment layer called the Hue Saturation adjustment layer. Click on that to create a new layer, and we now have a new hue and saturation layer above the layer that we adjusted the curves. And then you'll see you've got three sliders here: hue, saturation and lightness. We're not going to change the hue. That effectively changes the color balance in the image. You can see that we can drag that around and we get some really quite weird effects. So if you inadvertently select that and start moving it around and you don't like the effect, just double click on the word hue and it will reset it to 0. What we want to work on is the saturation, and what I want to do is I just want to selectively choose this part of the image, the sunrise colors, to increase the saturation there. Now I could take a guess and just say, well, let's increase the saturation overall, but what happens is that it increases all of the colors at the same time and I end up with some pretty horrible results. So let's just go back, reset that, and if we look up here, we've got a channel here called master, and I can individually select those colors and adjust them. I could just choose the yellows and increase the yellows, and that would give me something pretty close to it. And there's maybe a bit of red in there as well, so I could go to the reds and adjust up the saturation of the reds, and that doesn't affect the blues or the other colors in the image. Or alternatively, I can use this targeted tool. You can just click on that and that changes that tool to a little temperature sensor. Click on the image where you want to adjust it and it will simply adjust those colors alone. Now obviously that's way too bright, so if I then move to the left, it will reduce the saturation, and in fact I can take all of the color out if I go into the minus. So let's just reset that, double click on saturation, select that tool, and then let's just increase that slightly. And then of course you can go to other parts of the image and increase the saturation if you wanted to, this aqua color, but of course there are lots of blues in that image, so the blues channel is something we don't want to adjust. Let's just leave it with the yellow color, and we can see how much we've done by clicking the eye on and off, and we can see that we've made an adjustment and it's just affected that part of the image. Now while we're working with adjustment layers, one last thing to remember is we have a couple of other properties with adjustment layers, and when we look at our layers panel, firstly at the top section of the panel we have a word here called normal. Now that indicates how this adjustment layer is going to be blended to the layer below. Now if I click on that, it will open up a whole series of choices on how we can blend the information, and these are based on certain mathematical properties that will allow us to, for instance, dramatically change how the information is blended to the layer below. And you'll see that if you just move down and hover over these, you will see the effect of these different blending modes. Now there are quite a number here, but in reality you're only ever going to use a couple of them. So let's just go back, leave this one at normal, and just remember that there are options here that we will come to for some of the other techniques that we use later on, and we'll use different blending modes. The second one is here on the right of this is an option called opacity, and what we can do is we can change the opacity of that effect from 100 down to 0. Obviously if it's at 0 opacity, the effect has no change on the image, and if we have it at 100%, the effect that we've applied with that adjustment layer is at full strength. And this is often a way to just really refine those adjustments. If I was, for instance, to go into this adjustment and increase that saturation, and then I decide, well, that's really a little bit overdone, let's just drop the opacity back a bit, and we can see how that is then just reduced very, very minimally without major dramas. So we can have a different blend mode, we can have a different opacity for our blending layer, for our adjustment layers, and of course we can turn them on and off to see the effect. You'll also see under here a thing called fill, which looks as though it does the same thing as opacity, but it actually does work in a slightly different way, and we use that on some other special types of adjustments, so we won't cover that in this tutorial. So finally, in this first initial tutorial on Photoshop Basics, we're just going to cover saving and reopening your file. So at this point we've done a bit of editing selectively to our image, and let's decide we want to save that and we want to be able to come back and re-edit that at a later time. So we simply would go up to File. Now I've already given this a file name, so I would just simply go File, Save. I'm going to just click on that and save it. And once it's been saved as a Photoshop or a TIFF file, you have the option of reopening it and adjusting these layers later on. And it's always good while you're learning how to do editing is to save your images with these file adjustment layers intact. Now that's now been fully saved. I'll close that other file that we looked at earlier, and let's close that one as well. So we now have that file saved with all those layers intact. Let's just go back and I'll reopen this file. It was called test, and it will be opened with all of those layers still available. We can still re-edit those. Now if you are saving your file as a TIFF format, let's go File, Save As, and instead of being a Photoshop file, let's choose TIFF, which is the very last one, and I'll still leave the same file name. We'll just save it as a TIFF. When you do that, you will get an option here to save the file with or without the layers. Now obviously you want to save them with the layers. We don't want to compress the image. We want to keep all of these things as they are, and it will also save the image with all of the layers intact. So that's the basics of doing some simple adjustments in Photoshop. In the next couple of tutorials, we'll cover some more sophisticated aspects of this selective, non-destructive editing in Photoshop. So thanks very much for watching. I'll see you on the next video.